insights as to the dynamics around cooking entirely with electricity. And I'll just get directly into it. So in terms of the report outline, we're going to have 4 sections, or rather towards the presentation, 4 sections. The first is the introduction, then we'll discuss a little bit on the approach and methodology, and then on the third, we'll see the results and findings, and finally, the recommendations that were present within that report. So as an introduction, so my name is Alois Mbutura. I work at ED Advisory as a manager, and I'm right now researcher in energy and energy transitions. I do have an electrical engineering background from the University of Nairobi, but previously I have worked in engineering and also research and development in various places, Switzerland, and also worked on a host of projects towards West and East Africa, along telecommunications, software engineering, data science, and also just energy and energy transitions. And just a brief background as to ED Advisory. So ED Advisory is a Pan-African consulting firm whereby we provide a lot of technical and advisory services in energy, water, and climate change. And initially founded in 2013. So our host of clients include private sector agencies, public sector agencies, also research institutions, and a bit of the clients that we've worked with are shown at the bottom. So they span all across our business lines, which is energy, water, and climate change. So just as to the background as to what actually happened in order to come up with a project, just looking specifically at cooking with electricity entirely. So in terms of the statistics that are currently there, so what we currently know is that there are 23 annual deaths attributed to household air pollution, and that's based just out of the Ministry of Health report that was based in 2021. And secondly, what we do notice is that a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions that are currently present are actually from residential cooking, right? So the ability to abate the cooking sector is actually a key focus in terms of GHG abatement. And then what we also do notice is that despite Kenya increasing its access to electricity, the access to clean cooking still remains quite low, right? So that represents a gap and a possible opportunity to try to look at what would essentially happen if people cooked entirely with electricity, what barriers would be present, and what opportunities as well would be present that we can take advantage of. And also building up on current developments is that the Kenya Cooking Transition Strategy estimates that 60 billion shillings or $402 million is required to transition the 9.1 million households to clean cooking in order to close that gap that we see, right? So in terms of what we do have also on the left, so we have in terms of the World Bank funding allocations to access deficit countries, of which, as you can see, clean cooking takes quite a small portion, with majority of the portion actually allocated towards electricity generation, transmission, and distribution. So the ability to increase that actually presents a sizable opportunity, for example, just within Kenya, which is our focus today. So in terms of the assignment, so the assignment covers the exploration of cooking with electricity on a few households within Nairobi, and I'll get deeper into that. And the main objective of that is to assess the implications of households cooking entirely with electricity, using, first of all, a portfolio of cooking appliances, as opposed to other studies that might have been done before this study, whereby they mostly used single appliances. So this essentially offered to the participants the appliances that were available within the market, and therefore trying to assess what is the implications in terms of the barriers and the opportunities with regards to trying to cook entirely with electricity. And the specific objectives is that we were trying to assess the energy implications, the benefits of transitioning, possible barriers that people may face, and finally, dynamics around user experience and also user preferences while cooking with electricity. in terms of the methodology, in terms of how we essentially went around this. So the assessment was split into 3 phases. The first is the assessment of the electric appliances available within the Kenyan market. Secondly, the data collection of essentially the energy use and appliance usage metrics while trying to cook with electricity. However, the study for data collection is split into 2 phases. The first phase is a baseline phase whereby we just monitor the appliances as is, right, at the household with no intervention. And then there's a second phase that assesses transitioning these households fully towards electricity. So that also happened as the second phase towards data collection. And then towards the tail end of the study, we analyze this data and essentially present it in the report that was released in May 2023. So as the first step towards this step, in order to assess people's ability to cook with electricity, we assess the available appliances within the market. And the reason is that when somebody's trying to cook entirely with electricity, you can only use what is available to you within the market, right? So based on our assessments, we focused on 3 key appliances. The first one is the electric coil cooker. The second is the electric pressure cooker. And then the third is the air fryer. So those are the 3 appliances that we got from this study that were available for use in terms of transitioning the households towards electricity. And I'll dig a little bit more into that. So in terms of the baseline methodology as to how we got data as to how much energy is used. As you can see here on the left, we have a household that has 2 cooking gas cylinders, which is LPG cylinders. So one of the key ways we have to look at is to how we able to convert the energy, sort of like the weight measurements within, for example, like LPG, directly into energy estimates, right? So we'd have the households, for example, after each cooking event, whether it's supper, breakfast, or lunch, they would measure the cylinder, right? And then we'd actually record this on a form whereby we'd calculate the weight before and the weight after in order to get what's that difference, right, in terms of the weight of the fuel that's used, and then we'd convert that into energy. And in the transition, we utilized electric or rather automated measurements from devices to be able to assess what exactly was the energy that was used. So as you can see within the top image, we have an image of an electric pressure cooker connected to a data collection device. So the data collection device would send data remotely to a server that we'd have. And then what we would do at the end of each day, we would combine this data in preparation for the next day, being able to look at whether an appliance was used, if there was any issues faced by the household, and just being able to catch a lot of these issues early. It can be quite a challenge when you're transitioning a household fully towards electricity. There tends to be teething issues, and being able to look forward and assess the issues that would come about was actually a key part of the process, and the devices that you see within this slide actually helped within that process. Right. In terms of the results, now just digging into what we had, right? So the study itself was focused on 10 households, right? And the mean of the households in terms of the members present was actually 4.4. So in comparison, when we look at the national statistics for Nairobi, the mean number of household size really is 2.9 members. So the people that were within the household were typically more, on average, within the household that we measured. And secondly, we split the sample size across 50% low income and 50% middle income. The threshold in terms of these income groups are defined by the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics that defines at the time that $382 was the threshold to be able to disaggregate these 2 groups, right? And finally, in terms of the main cooks, so 9 of the cooks were female and 1 cook was male, and most of them actually had a tertiary level of education. So that means that they would either be have education at the university level, college level, or the TVET level. So the TVET level is technical training and vocational school, sort of like a technical school per se in other markets. And based on what we saw within the households, the images on the left show the typical cooking appliances that we found within the household. Of particular use was the LPG top stove, given that this is an urban household, so LPG was actually used quite a lot. And we also found a few electrical appliances. Most notably, we also find in rice cookers, which we found actually quite surprising, in addition to the typical microwave that is quite ubiquitous within Nairobi households. So in terms of appliance usage, so how does appliance usage look across the baseline and the transition? So in terms of what we actually see is that for the baseline utilization, LPG was typically used 65.8% of the time. However, it did reduce quite significantly within the transition to 11.3%. However, electricity use did increase within the transition, and the rest actually did reduce, right? With the notable exception of the microwave, which was typically used consistently across the baseline and the transition. So in addition to that, we also did notice that out of the appliances that were given in terms of electricity, so people had a few issues, especially using the hot place in terms of safety and also the speed of cooking, right? So that was a notable identification of something that we did notice with regards to electric appliances, and I'll dig into that a little bit more. So in terms of cooking patterns, how did the introduced appliances possibly change any cooking patterns that we did see? So based on the results and the findings, we noticed that the typical meals that are typically are 3 per day, which is breakfast, lunch, and supper. The breakfast meals typically tend to have 1 dish per meal, and then also the same towards lunch. But what we do notice is that there's a lot more freedom in terms of cooking towards supper, whereby people could typically create 2 meals, 3 meals per day, and they had the freedom to do so. So the reason why we actually did this was in order to note what is the intensity of appliance use across the 3 meals across the day. So based on this data, we noticed that the high utilization time with regards to appliances is actually towards supper time, as opposed to breakfast or lunch, whereby the meals are typically simpler in nature. And also in terms of just looking in terms of how the foods are cooked, so we did analyze how the foods are cooked across the various fuels, which include LPG, electricity, and also charcoal, right? So at the top there, we have the use of LPG towards the baseline, and secondly, the use of LPG towards the transition towards the bottom. And on the right, we do notice that ugali and chapati are very difficult foods to transition. It is possible, however, we'll dig into it a little bit later in the barriers just to see why exactly it was not possible to transition these meals completely. However, in terms of what was actually cooked on LPG did not change across the baseline or the transition. However, one thing that we did notice is that percentage reductions were present in terms of people shifted a lot of the meals towards electrical cooking appliances, and therefore you'll typically notice that the percentage utilization per dish is typically reduced, right? However, cooking of beans is still present, and I'll define cooking of beans as a very energy-intensive activity, which requires preparation and boiling for long hours. So usage of LPG to cook beans was still present. However, some of it was offloaded off to electricity and charcoal, as you will see within the subsequent slides. So here we have, for example, for electricity, whereby we notice, for example, that majority of use is actually dominated by microwave and kettles in the baseline. So in terms of that interpretation, the top is mostly for microwaves and kettles. And then for the bottom, we typically have the same for electric pressure cookers, electric hot plates, and air fryers. So while cooking, we did notice that actually rice was the most popular, which is also in line with other literature that actually says that rice is actually quite a popular meal in terms of usage on electricity. And we also noticed increases in other meals present while cooking with electricity, and also cooking of beans. However, cooking of beans being quite an intensive activity was not, we were not able to transition the households fully towards that due to limitations on the electric cooking appliances that we'll cover towards the end while we're discussing about barriers. And then finally, we have foods cooked using charcoal. So you'll notice that usage of charcoal diminishes quite completely between the baseline and the transition. And the reason why, for example, beans is difficult to transition is because the transition occurred within the January period, so right after the holidays. So what typically happens within Kenyan households is that during the holidays, people will typically stock up on cereals, right, that they do receive from relatives. So during the January period, people would carry out intense cooking activities of these cereals and preparation of the cereals for packing for use in the subsequent weeks and the subsequent months. So due to limitations on the electrical cooking appliances, especially on the ability to cook large amounts of cereals, created the opportunity for households to still cook using charcoal, right? And we'll discuss a little bit about electrical appliances limitations a little bit later into the presentation. Additional data that we do have in terms of energy use, once we stack the households, what we see is that there are typical reductions in terms of energy per capita per day. And we also do notice in terms of that how people cook tends to translate directly into energy use estimates. So there are some households that tend to be very efficient, especially when cooking, using electricity. For example, some households might prefer to use an electric pressure cooker in place of an electric hot plate, or they have different patterns of cooking. So what you'll find is that some households typically have lower energy estimates within the transition than others per capita, right? And then the transition data was also dominated largely by electric pressure cooker use. However, also air fryer and coil cookers were also present within the study. However, the use is not as extensive as the electric pressure cooker use, which some households said that they could actually satisfy 60 to 70% of their meals just using the electric pressure cooker. And then for the findings of the results with regards to electricity use, or rather energy use, so when we take all the data and we put them right on a graph, we collapse all that data into 2 dimensions, whereby we're looking at what was the percentage of using electricity for cooking and also just looking at the energy per capita. We notice that there's a graph that tends to trend straight down. And the individual points on the graph are each household within the study. So not all households transitioned equally within the study. So once we plot this, we see that there's a graph that tends to reach this point at 100% electric cooking. And once we look at the energy estimates, we put that as 29.82 to 59.65 energy use at 100% electric cooking. And based also on this data is that the estimates are very likely to change based on the technology of the appliances used. At the time, we used 3 major appliances, which is electric pressure cooker, the electric coil cookers, and finally the air fryer. In the event that the technologies may change. For example, the introduction of induction cookers, therefore, the estimates drafted here may possibly change with changes in technology. And then finally, in terms of costs, energy per capita cost does reduce. For example, at 100% electric cooking at the time was $0.02 per dish per capita cooked with electricity. And then what we also do notice, once we also look at the other side of the graph, which is at 0% electricity use, so that leads to a cost of $0.13 per capita per dish, right, within the household. Now, in terms of barriers actually faced by the household, so we categorize them into various categories. But the main categories that we did notice was supply of electricity as a limiting factor. Secondly, electric cooking appliance limitations. And then finally, user limitations. So some of the complaints that were received was, for example, the unreliable supply of electricity. So for example, we would encourage the households to cook using electricity. However, the presence of, for example, a blackout would limit the households in terms of utilizing electricity, or some households actually used shared electricity meters, right? So when a household shares an electricity meter with two other households, there is a gray area in terms of how much electricity have I used, right? So based on that, some households actually do shy away from utilizing electricity just due to that ambiguity that we noticed. And secondly, on electric cooking appliance limitations, the opinions received from the households were actually varied, right? So for example, some households complained of the slow cooking time of the hot plate, whereby it would take too long to prepare some foods. So all these implications led into the energy use estimates that we've seen in the previous slides. And secondly, some households actually did complain about the limitation on electric cooking appliances with regards to the number of pots available. And I'll explain this with an example. In Kenyan households, in order to save time while cooking, households will typically batch cook at the same time, sort of like parallelize the cooking activities in order to complete cooking faster. However, giving a household one electric pressure cooker, what we did realize is that some households complained that cooking took a little bit too long, and therefore they requested certain requests, for example, extra pots if it was not possible to parallelize the cooking activities. Therefore, at least it could occur sequentially, right? And one might argue, you could empty out the food and then put it back into the electric pressure cooker. But some households did not want that because it added to the mental cost of cooking. So that was one of the things that we did notice, and the request to actually have extra cooking pots as part of the package that the household did buy. And then safety concerns with regards to the hot plate, and which typically summarizes a lot of the complaints that we received around the hot plate. And some households actually did give varied responses. Some households complained of having too much to cook, but other households actually did complain of having too little to cook. So it's that conundrum whereby I have too little to cook. What's the use of using, for example, an electric pressure cooker, right? I could just pop it on to the LPG and I could get on my way. On the other side, we have households that had too much to cook, right? Whereby I have to boil beans for my household for several weeks. And therefore, the electrical appliances that I've received are actually too few to be able to enable me to do that in reasonable time. Okay? And finally, on user limitations. So some households actually did complain of a lack of awareness in terms of the financial benefits, in terms of the costs of cooking with electricity at the time. And also the belief that meals cooked on certain appliances actually did taste better as opposed to being cooked on using electricity, for example, electric pressure cookers. And finally, some households just had preferences just to just because of being used to utilizing LPG, they did prefer just utilizing specific appliances or fuels like LPG. And then in terms of the frequency of the complaints, majority of the complaints were actually on the hot plate being too slow to cook and blackouts. And then as you can go down the list, you can see the frequency of each complaint, right? Lack of adult supervision, for example, was a safety issue that was noted when cooking with electric hot plates, right? So that may possibly give an opportunity for new technologies, for example, induction cookers and so on. And then finally, as you can see there, there's a balance. For example, some households complain of too much to cook and too little to be cooked. So appliances really need to get that balance right? How much is too much and how much is too little, right? In terms of the barriers faced and looking at it per household, towards the top, you have the individual household IDs, and then on the left, you have the complaint. As you can see within this image, you can see that the hot plate being too slow to cook was actually a cross-cutting issue across all households. And in addition to that, you also have blackouts, which tend to be a cross-cutting issue across several households. So combined with the previous slide, which shows the frequency of complaints, the topmost priority based on what we've seen is tackling the issue of appropriate appliances and also grid reliability to allow electrical cooking to scale. So for end user perspectives, in terms of the electric cooking appliances, the households typically did note that the electric pressure cooker with its automated controls and also its energy savings allowed the electric pressure cooker to be used easily. Within some households, the older members of the households or the parents would typically come later towards the day. So you would have some households that would direct the children to prepare the meal before the parent comes later towards the night. So the ease of use is actually something that's critical in terms of some households, especially those that have young children or young children that are able to assist in cooking activities. Secondly, the electrical cooker had concerns, especially on the exposed elements. However, given that the electric coil cooker is an appliance that's available in the market, it leads to the question whether there's a suitable replacement towards the electric coil cooker. And if there is a replacement, then it would definitely mitigate some of the disadvantages of using the hot plate, as we found. And then we also had some complaints on, or rather user perspectives on social and cultural beliefs, whereby some households believed that cooking utilizing LPG was typically easier, for example, like ugali. But we also found, on the other hand, some households that actually did appreciate cooking, for example, ugali using the electric pressure cooker. So there's kind of like a balance, or rather diverse views in terms of what people believe is socially acceptable cooking within the Kenyan context. And finally, on food and appliance compatibility, the households did believe that the electric pressure cooker could handle a large amount of whatever they actually cooked on a day-to-day basis. However, the air fryer was mostly used for special cooking activities, for example, like frying or preparing meats. Therefore, it would be termed essentially as a niche appliance. And also the hot plate. The hot plate did represent a possibility of using it on intensive cooking activities. However, the disadvantages outweigh the advantages greatly. And therefore, that also presented quite a compatibility issue with regards to using of the hot plate to the households. Then finally, on recommendations. So part of the recommendations cover in terms of supply of grid improvement. We do understand that since the study was published, there has been numerous activities on grid improvement, right? Including KPLC seeking loans in order to improve its distribution of its network. And therefore, this is quite a commendable achievement that has been done, especially on improving the quality of supply, in addition to just increasing the access towards the grid for the Kenyan people. Secondly, in terms of consumer awareness, being able to recommend that the consumers actually made aware on the benefits of cooking with electricity. However, what we've noticed is we have seen billboards within the Kenyan capital actually showing the benefits of cooking electricity with actual numbers and figures, right? In addition to current initiatives such as the Pikana Power Center that's based with KPLC. So there is a lot of consumer awareness, and we are really happy seeing some of the recommendations being put into place based on the findings of this report. And then we have also noticed some manufacturers actually giving consumer-friendly cookbooks. In terms of customer support, we received some customers whereby they would ask, how exactly am I supposed to use this? So the provision of cookbooks actually does reduce even at a company level, does reduce the cost of support in terms of customers, right? We had customers that would say, I just looked through the cookbook in terms of what exactly I wanted, and therefore I found it, and I followed the instructions as is. So we have noticed within the Kenyan market that based on this recommendation, we have noticed, for example, one other manufacturer actually implementing a cookbook as part of its product offering towards the customers, and that's actually something that's really appreciated based on the findings of this report. And then on research and development of new cookers, for example, replacement for the coil cooker, based on activities in the past few months, we have noticed the introduction of induction cookers into the Kenyan market. And based off of this, the induction cooker would help in terms of finding a suitable replacement for the coil cooker, of which, based on direct engagements with marketers for electric cooking appliances, the coil cooker does sell quite a lot. However, the lack of a suitable replacement limits the coil cooker being in a class of its own. So having a suitable replacement is actually quite commendable, and driving of more funds towards research and development of new suitable electric cooking appliances is something that is very much welcome. And then finally, one thing that we'd like to see, and also it's dependent upon the unit economics on the companies that market these activities, is the possibility of obtaining multiple pots, right? It was one of the comments that was obtained from the households. However, we do understand that unit economics might not allow for that. However, having it within part of the product roadmaps with regards to some of the marketing companies would actually help. And being able to provide this vis-a-vis, is it possible, right? That's something also that could be researched a little bit further, right? So thank you so much, and open for questions.
Thanks so much, Alois. Thank you for the good presentation, very informative. I have one question from Larry. So Larry is asking, have you considered cooking off the grid electrically, and what percentage of Kenya's energy use it for cooking? And then we also have Dido, who's saying interested in seeing how ugali is being prepared. Dido, I would encourage you to join the CoP WhatsApp group. There's so many videos there. So over to you, Alois, for those three questions.
Yeah, thanks so much. So cooking off the grid is something that has been researched also just by MECS. So for example, in terms of cooking off the grid, so I'll just go back to the basics. So cooking is a very energy intensive activity. So in terms of cooking, you're typically using kilowatt hours in terms of energy, right? So current technologies would either typically have a battery as part of it. So what we are noticing is that that part of electric cooking is something that's getting a little bit more interesting. However, it's still largely under research and development. And I'd like it, if John has more comments on the same based on the studies that they've performed, and based on what he's seen. Basically, right now it's mostly towards research and development. However, it's a field that is typically picking up. And in addition, right now the cost of batteries is reducing exponentially globally. So the cost of batteries right now, I might have left it at around, let's like $140. But it is reducing, generally tending towards $100 per kilowatt hour. So with reduction in battery prices may be an enabler towards cooking in off-grid settings. However, the potential is there, but it's still largely in research and development.
Thanks, Alois. There are two more questions for you. Could you please share the WhatsApp group? Oh, that's not a question. We'll share. John or Cyprus, if you're here, please, you can post the link. And do you know what happened after the study? Did the participants continue to use the appliances, or did they put them in the cupboard? So have you done any follow-up studies? And yeah, that is very important. It's been almost a year now.
Yes.
So yeah, over to you.
Yeah, so I'll say in terms of the appliances that are typically used, the two appliances that are most in use are the electric pressure cooker and the air fryer, right? As to the households that got them. So the households are still using them, especially as they are very cost saving, right? So we, for example, do visit some of the households from time to time, and we actually do see them actually using them, even in terms of preparing meals when we visit. So that is something that is also present based on what we've seen. However, the research of that in terms of use after the study, it was not part of the study. However, this is just based off our visits towards the participants after the study. But they're still using the appliances and they still have them. Yes.
Thank you. I think, yeah, that is what we really need to know. Doing such follow-ups is very important, and also collecting like impact stories so that we have like good news for the shy or those people who want to hear from especially Swahili language, or a local Kenyan who has used probably a recipe that has worked best for them. Those are kind of information that gives people confidence. I've also seen a question from Douglas: which specific appliances were considered slow? And are there similar alternatives that are much faster or efficient? Douglas.
So the appliances that was considered slow within the study was the electric hot plate. And, in terms of cooking would take quite a long time. You have somebody who's cooking for 1.5 hours in terms of just getting the hot plate ready. So in terms of the appliance that was quite problematic was the hot plate itself. Possible suitable appliances that come to mind would be the electric induction cooker as an electrical appliance that could replace this. However, it is still early days, but the potential is there. Currently, I think we have a manufacturer that's marketing the electric induction cooker, right? And we hope to see more of those within the Kenyan market. But at the time, there was no electric induction cookers based on our assessments of various supermarkets around Nairobi, right? So this is just recent developments. Yeah.
Thanks, Douglas. There is, Alois, sorry. There is another question from Emily. Did you have comparisons from KPLC to solar cooking? This can be answered by anyone else, even John or anyone who's been involved in a study in Kenya.
So I can possibly just answer that from the perspective of the study, is that we did not do comparisons with regards to solar cooking, just based off the objectives of the study, to be able to understand what are the dynamics around cooking entirely with grid electricity. However, if anybody has, like John or anybody else, any comments with regards to solar cooking, well appreciated.
John, can you speak to your comment? Sorry for.
Yeah, just to jump in there, we did a study in 2021 with ESMAP at the World Bank, and we were looking at the relative costs of cooking with electricity versus other popular cooking fuels in different countries around the world. And we actually had two different case studies there. One was on-grid in Nairobi using KPLC supply, and one was off-grid in Nakuru looking at an experimental solar electric cooking system. And actually in both cases then, electricity was cheaper than most of the popular fuels that are in use in those contexts, with the exception of collected firewood in the case of the off-grid system. So I'll put the link for that study in the chat in case anyone wants to look in detail. But since then, in the last couple of years, what we've seen is the emergence of commercial companies, which are now offering solar electric cooking systems, generally through a financing plan, because the upfront cost is very high. It's essentially like buying all of your cooking fuel for the next 5 to 10 years in one go, which no one really does in practice. So selling these as pay-go devices is one of the keys to unlocking the off-grid electric cooking market. Generally, these off-grid appliances are using off-grid systems are using the most efficient cooking appliances. So typically they use an electric pressure cooker or at least an insulated device and focus on the boiling part of cooking. Often they're not designed to do all of cooking, but do the part that's most efficient on electric, and then with the expectation that they would be stacked with another fuel, generally for the frying part of cooking. Back to you, Maureen.
Thanks, John. I think we've answered most of the questions, but if we still have a burning question, I think you can just unmute and ask your question if there is. We still have some 10 minutes. I can't see anyone unmuting or raising their hand, so I can hand this over to Cyprus for a wrap-up.
Yes.
You're muted.
Sorry. Yeah. So I was saying thank you, Maureen, for guiding us through this wonderful discussion. And thank you, Lois, for very engaging sessions. I think we've learned quite a lot, and some of the outcomes of this discussion are some of the things that people working in this sector have come across on their studies, also from various webinars they've engaged in. But just to highlight some of the key issues that you mentioned that we think are continuously being highlighted on the various studies that people have done before around the ease of use, preference by various households on which appliances they want to use to cook, even the barriers that are experiencing with regards to adoption of e-cooking. So you've highlighted issues around electricity supply, which is very common in this sector. You've also highlighted issues around compatibility of appliances and also user limitations. So I think these are very common challenges, as I've said, and a number of us have had this across the sector. But we also think that these are not just challenges that we can sit on. They've also provided opportunities for people to explore and identify ways in which we can resolve or either ease our way into adoption of e-cooking. So I think I would like to mention one of the projects that I think we've done. Sorry, I had to admit someone. Yeah. So I would like to maybe highlight some of the initiatives that I think are ongoing in Kenya that are either trying to resolve some of the issues that you've identified in this particular study, and also trying to adopt the recommendations that you've also provided in this study. For instance, the program on eCooking and capacity building and market development study, which was done in collaboration with MECS and Kenya Power. And in this study, we had around 12 projects, and these 12 projects, majority of them were basically trying to address some of the barriers you've identified, and also just to overall build the capacity of stakeholders within the sector. So some of the studies, for instance, that I would like to highlight that I think are addressing some of the issues you've mentioned is on consumer financing. This is a study that was basically trying to explore some of the financing opportunities that are existing in Kenya, and particularly the PAYGO model, which is has been very instrumental, particularly for the e-cooking sector, and has been able to enable people who are working within the electricity sector to transition some of the communities that we consider as underprivileged and are not able to afford the upfront cost of the electricity appliances. The other study is on Kenyanizing appliances, which also addresses some of the issues you've said around having user-friendly appliances, and also having user-friendly cookbooks. So for this, I think we have a number of cookbooks that MECS have published in collaboration with various partners across Africa. So these cookbooks are basically just highlighting various cuisines across Africa and how cost-effective they are when they're prepared using electric appliances, particularly the EPC, and also just highlighting the cost of fuel and the technology that is being used to cook. So these e-cookbooks are available on the MECS website. We'll be able to share as we continue having these engagements to enlighten more people, and also just basically to disseminate this information to the wider audience. The other study was also on appliance comparison. I think this is also a very important study that was done by Strathmore, and it also helps answer some of the issues on consumer awareness, and also just to enable the consumers to understand how compatible are these appliances, because issues of compatibility is also very common during these discussions. So I'm looking forward to having you join these sessions so that we're able to highlight some of these outcomes that came from that particular program, and we hope that you'll be able to learn a few things from that. Otherwise, I'm very grateful for having you join this session today, and we look forward to sharing more with you in the future. Yeah. John, if you have anything to add, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask actually as a question to Alois, given his experience with this study, then does he think that we should be actively promoting households transitioning to cooking entirely without electricity? Because our interventions to date have mainly been encouraging households to adopt new electric solutions as part of their existing fuel stack. But do you think it's a good idea for us to try and encourage people to transition to fully electric, given the remaining barriers that you've highlighted here?
Sure. Thanks, John, for the question. In my opinion, I say that it is a good next step to be able to try to transition households fully. So, and it's within this reasoning that, you know, you shoot for the stars and land at the moon. So, based off of that, Kenya's done extremely well in terms of just being able to increase access. However, just being able to move a lot of the demand towards electricity, also just for the benefit of the people and the country. There are a lot of benefits towards that. And once that happens, the manufacturers and the distributors start to take note, right? So in terms of the barriers that are there, it incentivizes the players and the actors to act on those specific barriers. However, there needs to be the first stone or the first chessboard piece that moves. So in my opinion, yes.
Cool, thank you, Alois. I see there was another hand that went up.
Let's see. Let me just check on the question.
Maybe it's gone back down.
No, it's up, Sarah.
Okay, thank you so much, Alois, for the wonderful presentation. It was really very nice. Such studies are really guiding us on the next steps for promoting eCooking, especially since it's a nascent, a very new area of technologies. But then my concern is more of after-sales services. We are doing the promotion of eCooking, and this is a very great work. But much or less emphasis is put on after-sales services, given we are, most of the distributors are distributing electric pressure cookers and microwaves, but there are some challenges that come along with how do they use them, or some of the issues. For example, I'm from Uganda, but we experience a challenge of pressure cookers which do not cook very well, which after sometimes the temperatures reduce and they take long to cook, maybe rice which was taking only 12 minutes to now 30 minutes. And most of the people is it the user's side? So we need a lot of trainings while promoting these clean cooking technologies, these pressure cookers especially. We need to sensitize people on how to use them, especially on the side of safety. At the same time, we have to increase on the number of technicians or electricians who can help to repair in case very many people have got such scenarios in an area. We put less emphasis on trainings for the after selling them or after giving them to the end users. Though maybe I joined late, but I didn't see this coming out clearly from the end user side in case there are people who are complaining of how do we handle the issue of after sales services even after giving them to people or selling them to people. Suppose such issues. Thank you.
All right. And that's a really good question. In terms of the appliances that we picked, so each appliance came with a warranty and with details as to a recourse that would happen in case if any issue was faced by the user. And as part of our selection criteria for the appliances, it was actually like a key part of the selection criteria. And yes, I also do understand that in terms of there is a cost towards after-sales services on the appliances themselves. And some of these issues may stem from, for example, compatibility with cooking activities. However, there is the possibility of being able to mitigate some of these effects earlier on by, first of all, understanding who is the user or the typical user of this appliance. So a little bit more investment beforehand into the market research and just being able to characterize who is the customer and also just to test out the limits of whatever one is selling. In the event that that is not present, so back in my days when I typically used to do product development, so there would typically be an increase in product support and sort of like after-sales services. People bring their electric pressure cookers beforehand, or you have pressure cookers or just appliances that are not yet fully tested to the rigors of the market, right? And I have seen a lot of that, and in different sectors, for example, in refrigerators, in solar water pumps. What we are seeing now is some players within the market trying to implement specific tests that mimic how the user is going to use the appliance, right? This is in addition to the tests that typically happen before you import an appliance, right? So these are additional internal tests. Some other players within the market, and I'll say, for example, like what I've seen in the mobility space, is that some players dedicate some appliances to be used on a specific category of users, right? And they'll typically categorize these users as test users. So throughout the usage of the as they're selling, they will typically keep an ear to the ground with this dedicated team of users, right? Just be able to understand, is there anything that they need to forecast along? However, being able to forecast that user support has a cost in itself, and being able to forecast that cost beforehand will enable players within the market being able to optimize their operations. You see, what can we bring ahead in order to mitigate things that would come afterwards? Thanks. I believe I've answered it. Cyprus.
Yeah, Sarah, is that okay with you? I still see your hand is up. Okay. I think you still have some questions on the chat.
Yes, I see for Emily. Emily has a, and also John has a question. So let me just answer Emily's and then I can get to John. So Emily's asking, what's the view on, or the outlook on electric cooking for institutional users, or my view? So for institutional users are sort of like intensive users of cooking, right? Currently, I believe most of them use biomass on the scene. However, when we look at electric cooking with regards to institutional users, I believe the largest pot size that I have found within market service is that it's a 40-liter pot, right? So based off of that, I would say institutional users are possibly part of the pipeline. However, there is even more work to be done along that line, right? And I see that John has raised his hands twice. I don't know if you'd want to add on the same. John,
I actually had a different point, but I think Beryl probably wants to contribute on that one. I see her hand has gone up.
Okay, great, Beryl.
Yeah, thank you. So just to add to that regarding the e-cooking for institutional use, so far I think we've part of what Alois is saying is partly true, because the kinds of appliances that we've done, we've had a few studies done on institutional cooking in Kakuma and at ISR within Kenya Power, where we have been using a number of pots that are up to 40 liters. But so far the pilots that we have done in these areas have had promising results, where we've tested for compatibility of the dishes with the kinds of e-cooking appliances that are there, and found that actually cooking institutional meals is possible using electricity and using the types of appliances that are out there, that is EPCs that are designed for cooking for large scale, within large scale settings. So we have another study that is currently just in the pipeline also. This one is going to be piloted we're going to be piloting an e-boiler that is around 250 liters in a school in Athi River, where we will also be testing for the same, compatibility, the time savings from this, the cost of cooking, so all these different components. But so far, we have seen that actually the costs are significantly lower when we cook with electricity, and this is compared to, say, firewood and LPG. We've also seen the time savings from cooking with this. So one of the projects that actually happened within the capacity building and market development program that CPROS referred to earlier, was around institutional e-cooking, and there's a report that is out for that showing all these different findings. So Emily, I can post the link to that specific report here, and you can just look it over, and then we can talk about what else is happening in this area. Yes.
I think the final question is from John.
Yeah, I just wanted to elevate one of the questions that had come in the chat around reliability. And I think the point was made that in order to cook all of your food with electricity, you would need over 95% reliability. I mean, I have to admit that even I don't cook all my food with electricity. I still have a cocoa stove for when the power is occasionally out. And then I still enjoy doing nyama choma with briquettes. But I'd say I probably cook 95% of my food with electricity. With energy storage, I probably could cook maybe 98%, so it would just be the nyama choma left. But I think the point I wanted to make was connecting to the data that we now have on reliability of electricity from the National Electric Cooking Strategy Baseline Study. So within that, then the Nivoni team used the multi-tier framework, the MTF, to categorize current levels of access to both clean cooking and access to electricity. So within that, then, all of the people who had access to tier 3 and above electricity were lumped together as those people who could potentially today transition to on-grid electric cooking. And that was around 68% of the population. So the majority of Kenyans can, 2/3 of Kenyans can already transition to some form of electric cooking. But I think we should do further disaggregation of that data in relation to that point, because we also know how many households are in tier 4 and tier 5. And by disaggregating those households, we can see who could realistically transition to completely cooking with electricity today, who, with the support of energy storage in their household, could transition to completely cooking with electricity. So that's probably the tier 4 and tier 3 households, and who would need an off-grid solution in order to start cooking with electricity. So that's the tier 2 and below households. So I think really by looking into that data, we have a very rich data set. We can really gain much more insights into the different forms that electricity can start to penetrate into the fuel stacks of Kenyan households, and really gain greater understanding of what is possible and what transition pathways are needed to shift people towards a greater usage of electricity within their fuel stack. Back to you, Alois.
Thank you. I think there's an extra question from Monroe.
Yeah, Alois, thank you for that. I believe what John has mentioned is crucial, because most of us find that we buy these electrical appliances and we just keep them in the, we don't use them because we have the narrative that electricity is quite expensive. So I believe most of us are ignorant. And if you could maybe have this data to showcase to most of the households, I think it will shift. It will shift their mentality on believing that using electricity is quite expensive. So I believe most of us are unaware of this information, and we should maybe hit the ground more. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks for that comment. Back to you, CPROS.
Yeah, well, I think I kind of did my wrap up way early. Yeah, apologies for that. But yeah, it's good to have extra time to engage. And those are really very crucial questions you're asking, I think. And it's very important that we are clear on how we want to continue going forward, especially with regards to transitioning Kenya entirely to electric cooking. But as John has said, it's also important to advocate for other cleaner cooking solutions so that we don't leave anyone behind. Since not everybody will be able to transition at the same time, but it's one step at a time. So it's important that we advocate for other clean cooking solutions, even as we try to incorporate electric cooking within our households. So with that said, I think this has been very useful discussion. We thank you all for joining, and we look forward to having you in the next one. Thank you all.
All right, thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Really enjoyable session.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Mhm.